Thank you very much, Professor Friedman. Special thanks to Mona Frederick at the Warren Center, my old friend Richard Blackett, who had a lot to do with bringing me here, and to the Howards for endowing this, or through your friend endowing this lecture. I can assure you it really doesn't get any better than this, than to have a chance to talk about Robert Penn Warren for the Robert Penn Warren Center at Vanderbilt. And the timing was extraordinary. I was beginning to work on Warren. He is now a large chapter in a new book I'm about to put out in August called American Oracle, the Civil War and the Civil Rights Era. The title comes from Robert Penn Warren. But I have to say, the other time I lectured here at Vanderbilt, which a few of you, I guess, remember, it was for the history department, and I was just beginning to speak about Civil War memory in a classroom somewhere on campus. And that day they were blowing off guns to get all the birds out of the trees. And this went on for 15 minutes. The room fell apart. I mean, it was, the cannons were blowing off, and I got accused of everything but staging it. So happily, the starlings are not around today, I hope. Red Warren was asked by the editor of Life magazine, when he was in the midst of writing Legacy of the Civil War, his wonderful little and principal contribution to the Civil War centennial. The letter from the editor of Life says something like, "So Red, you have to explain this appeal, this attraction that the Civil War has for the American imagination. That's what you've got to do in this essay." And Warren writes back and says, "Well, that's what I'm trying to do." He says, we think that war made us so great, it's a little bit like the dog looking at the refrigerator. It's one of those great Warren-esque metaphors. It's so weird and homely that it works. And the dog staring at we stare at that Civil War. We can't seem to stop looking at it for some reason. And here we are with the sesquicentennial, and not a day goes by. I don't get all of us who are, a friend of mine says we're all on the list of 1-800-dial-memory. If you study memory in America, you get a call every day about the Civil War sesquicentennial. I hope we kind of wear it out in the next year or two and don't go on for 4 years, but we might. Warren also, in a line that you probably don't read much, even if you're a Robert Penn Warren devotee, it's in his introduction to his own edition of the selected poems of Herman Melville. Many of you, if you know Warren, know that he loved Melville. I think probably his favorite writer was Herman Melville. But in his introduction, there's a line where he says, with probably a gleam in his eye when he wrote it, "That war, that Civil War, offered gods and devils aplenty." It doesn't capture everything that Warren thought or wrote about the Civil War, but it captures his point of view. It's not just always trying to find the middle of things, but he thought there were gods and devils on both sides, and he particularly liked the devils. To endlessly ponder the meaning and nature of the past was to Robert Penn Warren as natural as breathing. He first heard the music of poetry and storytelling as a small boy, and I know some of you know this, at his grandfather's feet, sitting on an unkept lawn in front of a farmhouse in Christian County, Kentucky in about 1911. He was probably about 6 when he first started going to his grandpa's farm every summer. He likely did not know it was the 50th anniversary of the Civil War that year, but his grandfather, Gabriel Thomas Penn, a Confederate veteran, did not let him forget it. Warren's grandfather lived on the isolated farmstead some 35 miles or so from the town of Guthrie in southern Kentucky, where Robert Penn was born and grew up. It was his grandfather on long summer days from whom Warren ingested and cultivated a child's wondrous sense of the past. Grandpa Penn was a lonely man. His wife had died many years earlier. He despised progress, said Warren, and most things modern, but he was a masterful storyteller. He told the grandson that only two good things ever came out of modernity: window screens and painless dentistry. We might add a couple more, but sitting in a wicker chair under a cedar tree, corncob pipe in his mouth, Warren's grandfather would regale the boy with stories of the Civil War. He served as captain under the legendary and notorious Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest. Grandpa Penn participated in the massacre of black Union troops at Fort Pillow in Tennessee in 1863 as well, although he did not reveal any details of that story to the youngster. He had also been banished from Tennessee after the war, or so said Warren, because of participation in the hanging of Union guerrilla troops. Crossing the Kentucky line had apparently provided a refuge for one Confederate veteran, or at least that's the way Warren told the story. Grandpa Penn loved to recite poetry and even to sing for the boy in a cracked voice. Byron and Burns served up in the grandfather's version of what Warren called a Scots tongue or automatic annual July treats. In this romantic, what Warren called backward-looking world of changelessness, he found an ever-present history, as he put it, and he craved it. But later in life, he would resurrect it over and over for interviewers. He would tell this story, he must have told it hundreds of times to interviewers, with what he called a kind of puzzlement, for he had picked up, he said, a vaguely soaked-in popular notion of the Civil War. Indeed, he had. I didn't get my impression of the Civil War from home, wrote Warren. I got it from the air around me and from the grandfather, whom his aunts said was an inveterate reader, which Warren always remembered hearing with a wry chuckle as a Confederate reader. This puzzling but enthralling sense of the war came to him from Grandpa Penn in what Warren called bits and pieces, sometimes bloody, but sometimes funny, the way most American Civil War enthusiasts still likely want to feel or comprehend that event. As a boy, he recollected the war was a mixture of what he called, I quote him, the wickedness of the Yankees, the justice of the Southern cause, whatever it was, I don't know, the slave question, with Lincoln, somehow a great man, but misguided. His sacred boyhood memory, as he called it, thrived on the romance of military history. He told an interviewer in 1969, and it was always a matter, he said, of, quote, suppose that Albert Sidney Johnston hadn't been killed at Shiloh on the first day, suppose that Jeb Stuart hadn't been on that city raid at Gettysburg, and so on. When young, Warren said, present and past seem utterly mixed, particularly if the tale told, he said, came from the older people, big in the Great War of 61 to 65. Forms of these earliest impressions never died in Warren's inherited as well as learned memory of the Civil War. They recur again and again over his many decades of writing and his almost unbelievably productive career. In a cluster of seemingly contradictory notions, Warren steadfastly remembered his grandfather as what he called a Union man who opposed secession, was against slavery, and knew it, quote, couldn't last, even if I gathered from conversation that there must have been slaves in the family. But above all, Grandpa was, he said, a good Confederate who maintained that once the war came, you went with your people. Warren repeated many of these phrases and stories later in his life as though they had bled into his own DNA. Steeped in what he called his deep soaking in Southern and military history, Warren would often end the retelling by declaring Grandpa Penn the, quote, wonderful idol who had read history aloud to me. There was nobody to talk to, said Warren. I got the benefit of his conversation. He was a captain of cavalry under Forrest and fought in many battles. He loved to relive the war with me. We'd lay it all out on the ground using stones and rifle shells. I'll move this podium up a bit. No wonder Warren came to love irony and hate ideology, to distrust idealism and abstraction, to forever probe the idea of original sin and whether redemption from evil was possible through his poetry and fiction. Grandpa was not all romance. He called the Civil War, quote, a politician's war, just worked up by fools, Southern fire eaters and Yankee abolitionists. Warren tried throughout his life's work to show how, quote, irrational history really was. To an interviewer in 1961, yet again asking him to explain how the Civil War was remembered in the South, Warren fell momentarily he fell momentarily into a remembrance laced with a remarkable level of honesty. I quote him, "It was very much alive, not an issue, but a reality of life. It wasn't a matter of argument. It touched everybody's life. In this very static society, everyone you knew over a certain age had been in it, and it was just as part of our emotional furniture of life, just part of the faith, as it were, and the drama of it all." Emotional furniture. The Civil War still is for lots of people who didn't have a Grandpa Penn. Anthropologists might take such language as Warren used right there as a near perfect description of how deep mythology takes root in any kind of community. Warren grew up knowing that somehow the Civil War was the great, mysterious, romantic event, the self-affirming myth that made the world around him. In such reminiscences by Warren, we can begin to see how deeply Civil War memory had been embedded in the Southern and American imagination. And though he always waxed a bit misty about his grandfather's influence, Warren left no doubt that he understood just how much memory of the Civil War in the South was always somehow about the present. In his small town of Guthrie itself, he wrote, "Most people worried much less about which color of the uniform your grandfather had worn and much more about how," quoting him, "the Civil War seemed to have been fought for the right to lynch without legal interference." All that emotional furniture, the myth, might be about valor and devotion on the fields of Shiloh or Corinth, but it might also be about the violence that it took to keep black people from getting white people's jobs. Now, half the people in this room probably memorized Robert Penn Warren's career one way and back. So at a risk, let me very quickly summarize a few things to get him up to the period of the centennial of the Civil War and then focus on a few works that he produced in that period. He went to high school in Clarksville, Tennessee, of course. He was an absolute prodigy, graduates from high school at age 16. Boyhood dream was to go to the Naval Academy. He was admitted. He couldn't go after the accident when his brother threw a piece of coal and took out his left eye. The rest of his life, he only could see out of one eye. Every time my eyes get tired now and I can't read very well, I think, God, Warren only had one eye. Stop complaining. Despite his mother's fears that Nashville would be the Southern Babylon, as she called it, he, of course, came to Vanderbilt. As early as 1923, while still only 18 or 19, I guess, by then, he joined the Fugitives, the group of writers here at Vanderbilt, as a teenager. And he came under the influence, of course, of Donald Davidson, John Crowe Ransom, Alan Tate, who was his roommate, and they all called him the Boy Wonder. This was the world of aesthetics and poetry and ideas that he became part of, and he actually called that group his real university, which which I'm sure was no offense to Vanderbilt. Graduates in 1925, and that included in 1924, of course, what appears to have been a suicide attempt. He was a very troubled young poet. He went to University of California, Berkeley to go to graduate school, where he felt like a fish out of water, and he quit. He then transferred to Yale in 1927, didn't stay there very long. He just didn't like graduate school. Poets, who needs a graduate? He's a poet, who needs a graduate school? Then he got a Rhodes, he went to Oxford, and while in Oxford, of course, he writes his first book, which was his book on John Brown. John Brown, The Making of a Martyr, published in 1929 at the tender age of 24. I don't want to be judged by anything I ever wrote when I was 24, I'm sure of that. That book's, of course, a diatribe against John Brown and virtually all abolitionists. Warren hated abolitionists, certainly in this stage of his life, and actually he never quite gave up his contempt for abolitionists. But it's also it still very much merits a read because it's a fascinating take on how martyrs and how mythology are actually made by people, that they don't just happen by some divine process. In 1930, he, of course, writes that famous or infamous little essay for I'll Take My Stand, the South and the Agrarian Tradition, the Briar Patch, which in part Davidson and Ransom sort of pushed him to write, but he always took full responsibility for this worst piece of writing he ever did in his own judgment, and would later say over and over and over every time he was pushed that he was wrong. It was a lame defense of segregation, and it ends with that final line, or nearly final line, let the Negro sit beneath his own vine and fig tree. Returns to the U.S., he rejected, yet another fellowship to do a PhD at Yale. He just kept rejecting Yale until they finally made him a professor there for 39 years. Took teaching jobs at LSU, eventually at Minnesota, where he went in 1942, and then finally to Yale in 1950, where he was a professor in the English department the rest of his life. And there are still a number of people around Yale who will regale you with Red Warren stories, usually about drinking, but often about literature as well. The novels and the poetry and the criticism began to flow from Warren in the 30s, in collaboration, of course, with Cleaneth Brooks and others. And in the late 30s and early 40s, of course, he worked on his masterpiece and produced All the King's Men. Now, I only want to stop on All the King's Men for a moment. I hope it's only a moment. It's not easy to only talk about that for a moment. But I finally gave it a careful read, a really careful read, mostly last summer. I'd always read parts of it, I'd always dabbled around it, I'd always plucked a quote out here or plucked a quote out there. I had rated it more than read it. How many books do we all do that with? And my God, is that book about the Civil War. My God, is that a masterpiece about Civil War memory. He invented, of course, this unforgettable character, Jack Burton, and like so many of his characters, the name just speaks volumes. He's a fascinating, sometimes lovable, and of course increasingly disreputable character, one of those many drifters Warren fashioned in his fiction, who are strivers against the tide of an overpowering and mechanical history and the weight of evil in the human heart. Burton is repeatedly jolted by the reality, as he says, that history is blind, but learns that man is not. Warren's reader is tantalized by the sheer brilliance at times of the writing and the recreation of that mid-20th century southern landscape of weathered farmsteads, country stores, fast cars on highways, too many fast cars on highways, actually, dank boarding houses, county fairs, dialects the author heard in his ear with perfect pitch, growing cities with depression economies, and a politics driven by dreams of the small farmers and workers crushed under the weight of corrupt oligarchs. Now, but Jack Burton, who works, of course, for Willie Stark, the governor of Louisiana, or whatever state we're in. Of course, he never names it as Louisiana. Jack Burton, a failed historian, stopped working on his PhD dissertation in American history. Don't listen right now, graduate students. because he just couldn't stay with it. And of course that dissertation had been on the incredible supply of records and letters from his great uncle, Cass Mastern, who had been a Confederate soldier in the Civil War. But the story that evolves, of course, is of Cass, and Jack learns of Cass's deep, tragic secret of a passionate love affair with his best friend's wife, Annabelle, a sin leaving Cass with unbearable guilt, his best friend dead by suicide, and an honorable house slave named Phoebe, sold south away from her own husband by the wretched Annabelle because Phoebe knew about the affair and the suicide. Jack remembers first being enthralled by his research as an escape from his dull life, but then recoils from the dark paths he finds. Rooted in long passages from Cass's dramatic journals, the great theme that pervades all the King's Men, and so much of Warren's work, thus emerges in layers of flashbacks and tragic turns between past and present. That great theme, history, personal and collective, first shapes and then infests the present, making living itself a struggle to fight back against fate at every turn. It is always the past, as Warren liked to put it, that, quote, rebukes the present, especially when proud humanity thinks it can live above or overcome it. And the South's struggle to face the past of slavery and defeat in the Civil War had given him an endless trove of material in which to ply his trade. I'll spare you any more riffs on all the King's Men. At some point I just need to go off and hide and write something on all the King's Men, I suppose. But of course Cass ends up completely destroyed by his guilt. He joins the Confederate regiment as a buck private rather than officer, goes off to war, tries to get himself killed, won't fire a weapon, and just doesn't seem to get shot. And finally outside Atlanta he is shot, and he eventually dies in a god-awful hospital in Atlanta and gets his wish. But then there's that magical paragraph where Warren gave us a metaphor for history. He gave us probably 500 metaphors for history, but one of the most unforgettable. It comes when Jack Burton is continually trying to ask why, about why did Cass do this? And then comes this passage, quote, Cass Mastern learned that the world is all of one piece. He learned that the world is like an enormous spider web, and if you touch it, however lightly, at any point, the vibration ripples to the remotest perimeter, and the drowsy spider feels the tingle and is drowsy no more, but springs out to fling the gossamer coils about you who have touched the web. You have touched the web, and then inject the black numbing poison under your hide. It does not matter whether or not you meant to brush the web of things. Your happy foot or your gay wing may have brushed it ever so lightly, but what happens always happens, and there is the spider, bearded black, and with his great faceted eyes glistening like mirrors in the sun, or like God's eye, and the fangs dripping. This was Warren at the height of his art, and the novelist as philosopher of history, which may have been what Warren ultimately was. That book can only end the way it ends. It all plays out, as many of you know, and poor old Jack Burton. I guess Jack Burton finds some kind of redemption in that story. It's a little hard to find. But then there's that passage where you're listening inside Jack Burton's head, and he says, for nothing is lost, nothing is ever lost. There's always the clue, the canceled check, the smear of lipstick, the condom on the park path, the twitch in the old wound, the taint in the bloodstream, and all times are one time, and all those dead in the past never lived before our definition gives them life, and out of the shadows their eyes implore us. Warren loved that metaphor of eyes always looking at us. And back in the Cass Masterton story, it was the eyes of Phoebe that Cass could not abide. Warren captured in his art, and he did it in All the King's Men brilliantly, one of the deepest truths of American history. There are no dead like the Civil War dead and the slaves who buried them. In 1961, Warren publishes 2 books. The 100th anniversary of the Civil War. He'd written many poems, of course, where the Civil War is laced through them. But for the centennial, he was ready. He not only wrote that little essay, Legacy of the Civil War, which I'll come back to in a minute, but he wrote a novel that I'm thrilled to hear you've been reading, and Richard and Michael have been using in their course, called Wilderness, A Tale of the Civil War. When I first read this, I thought, God, I got to put this back in print. It's such an amazing little book. And then I learned the University of Tennessee Press already did. But it got pretty well lost in 1961. I'm not sure how much readership it had. It got widely reviewed, but not very well. Critics weren't very kind to it, and haven't been terribly kind to it ever since for a variety of reasons. I don't want to belabor it too much, but it's a remarkable story. Now, it's entirely laced with classical allusions and metaphors and biblical metaphors, and almost overly laced with them. The story is of a young German immigrant from Bavaria. I'm guessing most of you haven't read Wilderness. Is that fair enough? How many of you have read Wilderness? Ah, good. Thank God. I'm telling you something you don't know at the Robert Penn Warren Center. Main character is a young German immigrant from Bavaria. His name is Adam Rosenzweig, Jewish, son of a 48er. His father had been in the German 48 Revolution. His father had died in prison. His father was his hero. He comes to America in 1863. He ships out to the U.S. planning to join the Union Army and fight für die Freiheit. He wants to fight for the freedom of the slaves. And right away, at the beginning, you think, oh, come on. But then he arrives in New York. It's July 1863, and what does he run into? It's nighttime. He walks into the city. He starts hearing mobs and screaming. And his first worry is that, oh God, the Union won. The war's over. They won while I was on the ship, and I can't get into the war. But of course, what he really runs into is the New York City draft riots. And the first vivid image he sees is a black man hanging from a light post, dead, with blood caked all over him. That's his first image of America. He then gets caught up by the mob. He gets saved from the mob, from being killed by a former slave, a black man, whose name is Mose Talbot. Mose saves him. And to make a long story short, the two of them then join up as kind of survivors with a sutler's wagon. That was a supply wagon in the Civil War. A sutler was a guy who sold supplies to the armies in camp. And the wagon was operated by a white Southerner whose name is Jadine Hawksworth, who had a hawk-like nose, et cetera, et cetera. And the three of them begin a journey, a long and at times, I think, enthralling journey south to get to the war, to sell Hawksworth's goods. It's a little bit of a rewriting of Huck Finn, without a doubt, I think, and a little bit of rewriting of Ellison's Invisible Man, and probably a little bit of rewriting of a lot of other things, not least of which is the Odyssey. Adam had a club foot, by the way. And all along the way is episode after episode in which Warren simply rubs his reader's face in the fact that this war is really all about race and slavery. My own favorite scene, and there are many, is a scene where a Union soldier whose name is Sims Perdue, a Medal of Honor winner, a total battlefield hero, who is as racist to the core as a human being can get, and he gets drunk one day and he decides to put on an entertainment for the rest of the Union troops. And he has the black camp hands gather around these big tubs full of flour. At the bottom of the tubs were dollar bills. And the black guys they all have their hands tied behind their back, and they have to dive into the flour with their teeth and pull out the money. And the drunken Union soldiers are cheering and having a grand old time. I think that's a rewriting of Ralph Ellison's famous opening scene in Invisible Man of the Battle Royale. If you've read Invisible Man, or even if you haven't, go back and read the first 50 pages of Invisible Man. And Warren had enormous respect for Ellison, and it was mutual. The black men, of course, finally raise their heads. They almost all suffocate. Some of them get the money in their teeth. They're, of course, turned white by the flour. Adam, our young idealist, tries to stop it, but Mose, the black guy, stops him, saves him, because he knows that Sims Perdue will kill him if he tries to stop it. So anyway, it all finally ends up at the Battle of the Wilderness, hence the title, in 1864 in Virginia. Along the way, Mose kills Janine Hawksworth for a whole variety of reasons, and Adam ends up with that wagon all by himself, trying to get to the war, just trying to get to the war. He just wants to get to the war. He wants to get a musket on his shoulder. He wants to kill a Confederate, and he finally does. He's in a clearing. I shouldn't tell you how it ends. It ends like so many of Warren's works in great ambiguity. And we don't really know if Adam's going to survive those terrible forest fires that are gathering all around. And there were famous fires after the Battle of the Wilderness. But he does finally kill a Confederate straggler. Warren's outlook on the world, and I think this is the most important thing we can understand about him, at least in my view. His outlook and his approach to history were imbued with a genuine, deep sense of tragedy. In a way, Warren may be said to have embraced tragedy not only as a mode or a timber for writing, but as a conception of the human condition. Tragedy was not merely a theme for him, but a natural load of limitless ore from which to fashion art, and thereby for him to understand life and man's reason for being. For Warren, genuine tragedy had little, if anything, to do with the sunny side versus the dark side of life or of history. That simply bored him. He simply assumed that the darkness, the instinct for natural fated evil beyond ultimate human control, drove history, whether for an individual or for a nation. In this tragic worldview, we can best comprehend Warren's conception of the Civil War's place in American history and memory. And only in an effort to find a genuine sense of tragedy through which to understand the Civil War, I think, can we ever peel away its beguiling sentimentality. Although he never stopped declaring his respect for soldierly virtues, Warren ultimately wanted the Civil War viewed not through the heroism of the blue and the gray, but through a lens fading in and out of dark. But in the darkness would still emerge meanings and stories that could instruct and illuminate minds conditioned, as he would put it, by pity, loss, and a clear-eyed sense of America as a place riddled with as much tragedy as anywhere else. The sheer seriousness of such massive fratricidal sacrifice for existential causes, Warren believed, the Civil War in other words, deserved an artistic and historical response that matched its gravitas, not sentimentality. Warren's remembrance and use of the Civil War were very personal, located in experience and regional identity, in the tales in his head he could never unload, in his southern border state sort of war zone origins. But the meaning of that event was part of a much larger view of art and of history. His broader meditation on the idea of people as creatures with past, partly knowable and partly not. Past we cannot dispose of, as we concoct one idealistic device after another in order to believe that we can. No one can break the bank of history, Warren wrote. Machiavelli, Darwin, and Freud had all tried, but even in their new and brilliantly conceived modern world, quote, the bank of the future remains unbroken. Especially for Americans who wish to live in the future, unburdened by the past. And I'm quoting him here, some explosively recalcitrant fact gets left out of the fine scheme. And this fact, like an unexploded grenade, is like an unexploded grenade in a rubbish heap. It is likely to cause trouble. Many of those grenades, believed this old Kentucky poet, had been strewn all over the American landscape, literally and metaphorically, by the Civil War. Gettysburg, Andersonville, or 1,000 old plantation houses and slave quarters were still minefields, he believed, into which Americans were bound to stumble. And Warren insisted that history ought to be both dreadful and inspiring. He loved Theodore Dreiser, the author of An American Tragedy, and I could go on and on about it. He loved Hawthorne. He didn't like the Sunnyside writers like Emerson or Thoreau. And above all, as I said earlier, he was a Melvillian. And he said more than once that he had become crazy about Melville. And he brought to Melville not only Warren's own sensibility, but I think one of the best ways to understand Warren on the Civil War is to see him through Melville and the way Warren wrote about Melville. As I said earlier, he edited his own edition of Melville's battle pieces. In fact, Andy Delbanco, who is, I think, the best modern biographer of Herman Melville, has said that Warren's essay on Melville at the beginning of that collection is the most original piece ever written on Herman Melville. And that's by Delbanco, who's written a few original things about it. What they shared, above all, I think, was this deep, genuine, and abiding sense of authentic tragedy. Warren, like Melville, loved the polarities in human nature and experience, and nothing quite like war exposed the most painful polarity of all, as he put it, that between all values and that between all values and the blank fact of our possible annihilation. Warren's heroes, though, like Melville's, were those who usually survived, gained knowledge from the tragedy of the human plight without forfeiting an ability to ultimately act. There was still history, after all, that had to happen, a future to be lived, action necessary at Petersburg in 1865 or Selma in 1965, and art to make. What worried Warren was the insatiable human capacity to mold experience into legend. Of course, he made up a lot of legend himself, and thereby bleeding it so that all meaning was sometimes bleached out, he said. Then wrote Warren, quote, "We are left to meditate on merely the gestures and the stances, the passion of the old participants, the passion with which they play their roles." In this language, Warren captured the formulaic, mythic elements that keep Civil War memory alive in the imagination of so many enthusiasts to this very day. Many readers and reenactors love, as they like to say, love the Civil War. I always get a little trouble when I get a phone call or someone comes up after a lecture and says, I've just always loved the Civil War. And I sometimes want to say, what is it you love about it? Which I think is what maybe Warren would have asked him. Well, he would lose, as Melville did, he would lose this battle, by and large, against the sentimentalist. I think most of us still are losing it, but not for lack of trying. Now, legacy. The little book he writes in 1961, that I know you've also read in a course. It's an amazing little creation of 107 pages or whatever it is. And how many have read Legacy? All right. I was so worried to speak on Warren here. I thought everybody knew everything in every one of his books, and I was so worried. Legacy of the Civil War is a poet's history. It's a prose poem of a kind. It's a meditation. It merits a close reading today. Parts of it hold up remarkably well in the face of modern historical scholarship, and parts of it don't. The book instructs and provokes on intellectual and imaginative levels all at once. It is an essay essentially about the power of myth at the heart of national historical memory. And above all, it is one of the most explicit examples of Warren's famous contention that poetry and history are not only compatible, but indispensable partners in searching to understand the past. In Legacy, Warren wrote, in effect, a prose poem about the big myths that we live, which is a phrase from him, the big myths that we live about our Civil War. Poetry is the little myth we make, and history is the big myth we live, as he famously wrote. Informed modern readers of this text will see that it is deeply informed by Warren's never-ending quest to pose the question, are we makers of our own fate, or is it all made for us in our nature? Or as he put it, quote, in that little book, can we in fact learn only that we are victims of nature and history, or can we learn that we can make, or at least have a hand in making our own future? I warned you, he's more a philosopher of history in some ways than anything else. It was his way of raising the perennial question about the Civil War's inevitability, the irrepressibility of the Civil War, which we as teachers sometimes get tired of dealing with. He loved that question. He never quite stopped asking it. Warren began his centennial meditation with big claims about the place of the Civil War in American consciousness. Boldly, he called the war the great single event of our history, our only felt history lived in the national imagination. You know, that's claiming a lot. There are a few other things we probably live in the national imagination. He also framed the meditation on the Civil War squarely within the Cold War context of the early 1960s. Cold War is all over that book. The Civil War, he maintained, was in our bloodstream, deeply pertinent to our personal present. The conflict with the Soviet Union, with national existence at stake, he said, demanded that Americans, quote, learn from that great crisis of our national past, meaning the Civil War. He wondered if the Cold War was a struggle of such moral difference that war with the Soviets was also inevitable. Lots of people were worrying about that in 1961. Did the nuclear fear and brinksmanship of 1961 make 1861 again relevant for Americans? And it comes in that Cold War moment in the book where he fashions that wonderful phrase from which I took the title of a new book. And so the Civil War draws us, he said, as an oracle, darkly unriddled and portentous of personal as well as national fate. But here's where we can ask of him, and he gives lots of answers. What kind of oracle is it? Is it still the same oracle, the Civil War, at 150 years that it was at 100 or at 50? Where is the oracle? Is it on Monument Avenue in Richmond? Is it at Stone Mountain in Georgia? Is it at the Shaw Memorial in Boston? Where is it? Is it really largely in our imagination? Hard to know, and you'll get 100 or 300 answers to that wherever you ask it. An oracular event had to offer more than passion, said Warren. Virtually all of Warren's gods, if you like, were fallen gods, except Robert E. Lee, whom he could only seem to adore. At least their causes and meanings, these gods, are part of a fallen man's struggle with himself, his own internal self-destructive battle between good and evil. 1861 to 1865 was a civil war of great inner drama, Warren would write, the prototype of all war, throwing men against one another with primal motives born of old ambivalences of love and hate and all the old guilts, the blood brothers of our childhood. Now, he would sometimes call the Civil War our Homeric period, and then he would fashion passages like that where you really think he's talking about it as a biblical event, and sometimes he just wouldn't really make that clear. But he did see the Civil War as a kind of grand metaphor through which Americans can see almost any conflict they have. He may overstate that, but I'm not convinced he did. For him, it was the mirror in which to understand the civil rights revolution that was happening at the very time he wrote this book. And throughout Legacy, if you read it with any care, you'll note that he repeatedly quotes many important and distinguished historians. Not just because he needed their imprimatur of a David Donald or a James Randall or an Arthur Schlesinger Jr. or a Peter Gell and Kenneth Stamp and all these people he quotes, but because he'd read them. He'd read them carefully. He was using them almost like primary sources. He got taken in by David Donald and Stanley Elkins. It's as though he had swallowed whole that early vision of abolitionists as anti-institutional fanatics who lived outside of society and didn't believe in government and just wanted to overthrow every institution in America. That was pretty much Warren's view of abolitionists. They were basically dangerous fanatics, and always beware the dangerous fanatic. He'll be trouble for the neighborhood. But there are other places where he is already digesting some of the early history of the black experience in America, and it very much informs what he wrote. He famously invented two paradigms or terms, slogans, that we still use once in a while. I've even seen people use it and not even know that they came from Robert Penn Warren. He called one the Great Alibi, which was his term for the lost cause tradition, for the way in which Southerners had created over time this cluster of ideas and legends about a noble cause that had never been a fight for slavery, that had only lost because of superior numbers and resources of the northern side, overwhelmed by Yankee despotism and industrialization, and a great alibi in the sense that for anything that ever happened after the Civil War, and he has some wonderful passages where he just sticks his thumb in his fellow Southerners' eyes, anything that people needed to ever explain away, as he would say, about the South, whether it was poverty or pellagra, as he says it once, or the boll weevil or anything. It was because of the way the damn Yankees overwhelmed them with industrialization and a great, noble, holy cause. He was a little imbued with the lost cause himself, don't forget. And part of what he's unloading there is his own past. His other label, the Treasury of Virtue, was of course for the North. The Treasury of Virtue was him sticking his fingers in Yankees' eyes. And he took the knife to them. This was all about Yankee righteousness, all about believing that whatever happened in America, the North had always fought the holy fight to end slavery, save the Union, and create a stronger, better America, and always claimed somehow that everybody in the North was somehow an abolitionist, which of course was nonsense. And he knew it. He talked about both of these ideas, the Great Alibi and the Treasury of Virtue, as he put it, rusting away the will to confront the truth, rusting away the will to confront a real past. Well, I was going to quote his priceless line about Henry David Thoreau. Yeah, I will. Why not? He not only had a contempt for most abolitionists, but for that kind of New England-conquered Emersonian crowd, the sunny side. He just didn't like them. He much preferred him a Melville to a Henry David Thoreau, as he said, who was a, quote, big old meatball of a fake with a genius for prose style. And since nobody reads Thoreau much anymore anyway, I guess it doesn't matter. And then he would invent, in Legacy, invented these terms that we still sometimes go back to. For the North, he called it higher lawism. Well, that was the claim by abolitionists that they were responding to a higher law than man's law, to God's law, and so God's morality, not man's morality. And then he invented this term called legalism, which was his way of describing the devotion to the states' rights doctrine in the South and to state sovereignty, which he believed, drove the South into the gutter. And above all, he was calling on both sides here in this memory struggle to remember, as he put it, that slavery was at the center of the story, and it could not, as he said, be, quote, talked away. Talked away, and we're still talking it away. And lastly, about legacy, if it has a hero, this 110-page essay, if it has a hero, it's less a person than it is an idea. And the idea was the philosophical worldview or the method of thinking known as pragmatism. For Warren, pragmatism meant, as it did for the great William James, among the most, if not the most, famous practitioner of it, a habit of mind, a belief that no idea or institution is ever completely fixed, and that the only thing utterly determined is change itself. The pragmatist urged a passionate commitment to the open mind, to the testing of all truths and principles, no matter how firmly you hold them. This notion of truth as unfixed made possible the liberating idea that Warren called experimental imagination. He loved William James. William James was almost up there in his pantheon with Herman Melville. It was this adaptable habit of mind that won the Civil War, Warren claimed. He called it Grant's systematically self-nurtured gift for problem solving and Lincoln's deft ability to, quote, be principled without being fanatical and flexible without being opportunistic. Warren was a pragmatist, a philosophical pragmatist. No question about it. Now, it's a little hard if all you're looking at is the carnage at Spotsylvania or the senseless killing at Cold Harbor to see pragmatism as a principal legacy of the Civil War. But that's really what Warren argued. Well, and that belief in, that spirit and faith and pragmatism is a big theme in all the King's Men. And by the way, one of the best stories I was told about Red Warren at Yale came from my neighbor, John Morton Blum, who knew Warren intimately. He was his tennis partner in Vermont and tried to be a drinking partner but couldn't keep up. And John loved to regale me. They were my next door neighbors until they had to move into a nursing home. And John said one day he finally got up the courage. Apologies to those of you who were at dinner last night because I think I told this. One day he got up the courage to say to Red, "So Red, is Willie Stark Huey Long? I mean, come on. Did you really do research on Huey Long?" He said, Warren's answer was, and I'm trying to capture the way John Blum tells it, he said, "Shit, I wasn't writing about Huey Long. I was writing about Julius Caesar, couldn't you tell?" Always something bigger, always writing about it. Of course, Caesar met the same fate as Willie Stark. Lastly, legacy of the Civil War got reviewed everywhere. For a little book, here's my editions, this old Harvard University Press edition. They let this go out of print. I couldn't believe it. This little book got reviewed everywhere, by everybody, in the American literati. He received dozens and dozens and dozens of letters about it. His very dear friend C. Van Woodward loved the book and wrote to Warren. He loved the emphasis on pragmatism. He said he really liked, he says, "I found the book quite happy, especially the, quote, Reb Yank antithesis, the great alibi and the Treasury of Virtue. Woodward urged Warren to make even more out of his border state angle of vision, calling Kentucky, quote, Lincoln-Warren country, between revelation happy Yank and deduction bitten Reb, the Alsace-Lorraine of pragmatism between all those crusaders." And Warren and Woodward carried on a beautiful correspondence like this, by the way. They'd sometimes write to one another and say, "Hey, Red, I'm doing a lecture tour in the Confederacy. You got any advice, you know?" Alfred Kazin, the great literary critic, reviewed the book and was annoyed, he said. He said he loved the book. It was fascinating, probing. But he said, why didn't Warren write a longer book? He said this was the great chance of his life to write the greatest nonfiction, he wanted a 500-page nonfiction book or something about the Civil War. he concluded his review by saying, in a sense, all of Robert Penn Warren's work could be called the legacy of the Civil War. And he was angry the book wasn't longer. Anyway, he also didn't pull any punches on Warren. He said, you know, look, Warren, if you attribute everything to just human nature and the evil in us, then what's left to explain? He landed a punch there, I think. Conservatives in the National Review didn't like it. Richard Weaver complained that Legacy had, quote, too many passages sounding like Mrs. Roosevelt. Liberals, Warren has just become one of them. Quote, making decrees of a central government in a persistent crusade against the South. Well, Truman Nelson in the National Guardian accused Robert Penn Warren of being an apologist for the white South and for too much, quote, psychologizing and romantic ambiguity about pragmatism. Well, Nelson stung Warren, in fact, when he concluded that he finished the book, quote, wondering when people are going to realize that this nation's real legacy of the Civil War is still in chicanery and will not be collected until all of its citizens can go to common schools and vote a common ballot. Then there was a New Republic review by Peter Jones, who read Legacy as simply, pure and simple, a segregationist appeal for a centenary of the war as an experience from which the Negro American is apparently excluded. I don't think he read the book. And that review so angered Warren that he wrote a heated reply and insisted the New Republic publish it and accused Jones, the reviewer, of guilt by association between Warren and the White Citizens Council, because in the review, this guy actually brought this up. Warren's just appealing, to the White Citizens. This really angered Warren. And he wrote back and said forcefully that he wanted to declare in print 3 principles for which I stand. And here they were. 1, that all Americans should have all rights of citizenship. 2, that a man's worth should be judged by his qualities of manhood. This comes right out of the liberal consensus of civil rights. And 3, that any state official who does not punish those who commit violence against anyone's rights should be impeached. He then went further, declaring Martin Luther King a great American and the sit-ins a strategy that, quote, will win. Warren even went so far in this piece, once again, he didn't have to, once again, to renounce his racial views, as he put it, of 1929. He didn't mention Briar Patch by the title. He just said, in my youth, I'm quoting, I was wrong. And even now, I sometimes do not feel myself entirely above an error. Let me end. In the book, I go on at more length about trying to define this sense of tragedy that Warren possessed and how he really was in part drawing it from Melville. But what Warren had found, of course, I think with the Civil War, even when he's only obliquely addressing it, was the grand subject of his life, a grand subject of his art and his imagination. He often framed his sense of tragedy in Melvillian terms. He would say, as Melville did, that tragedy ultimately must instruct us. And there's that lovely passage right toward the end of Legacy where he says, and we must ask ourselves today, have we been instructed by the Civil War? And he says, unfortunately, we must answer no. Well, Warren loved ambiguity, the things in between. By temperament, and I'll end with this, by temperament and experience, he was perhaps a bit like Abraham Lincoln, an ironist and a border state pragmatist. Much better poet than Lincoln. He was always in between himself, between South and North, between history and fiction, between the age of segregation in which he grew up and the age of civil rights in which he matured. Truth had never been clean nor obvious to Warren. Yes, he could dislike abolitionists and lampoon a Thoreau or a John Brown and gush over an Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., who he really liked, or a Hawthorne. By 1964-65, he would also interview and write about dozens of black civil rights leaders and thinkers in that wonderful book that I hope we can actually put out again that's fallen out of print, Who Speaks for the Negro? An amazing book, frankly. But truth, especially about something as vast and transformative as the Civil War's ultimate meanings, or for that matter, the essence of good and evil in the human heart, was just too messy and elusive, too easy to confine in easy judgments. And he preferred to never give anybody an easy way to make a judgment. Piety was the impulse in us that we needed to curb, he believed, if not destroy. As he aged, it was in his poetry that Warren kept trying to name and even define truth. But truth was a subject for the ever-squinting eye, in his view, and fertile imagination, not the intact treasure to be mined or maybe even actually found. In a poem called Truth, he almost got there, the last two verses. Truth is what you cannot tell. Truth is for the grave. Truth is the downy feather you blow from your lips to shine in sunlight. Truth is the trick that history, over and over again, plays on us. Its shape is unclear, in shadow or brightness, and its utterance, the whisper we strive to catch. Truth is the curse laid upon us in the garden, and is the sun-stung dust devil that swirls on the lee side of God when he drowses. God never completely slept in determining history's lessons, but neither did the devil. For Warren, the Civil War was this country's bottomless lode in which to mine for truths and lessons for the good of the Republic and for the poet of human nature. Thank you.
Thank you very much for making lecture number 16 so memorable. And we do have a bit of time for questions.
Yes, sir.
If I went into a Civil War battlefield, what would you suggest to be some kind of storyboard for Civil War memory? Because it's not, I've been to a couple of few battles, it's not there.
Is my mic still on if I don't stand up there? Is that still on? Yeah. The question is, if you go to a Civil War battlefield site, a national park site, what would be the narrative board, the storyboard, as you put it? Because you're suggesting this kind of story is not there. Is that right? I agree with you. A short answer to that is that for nearly 20 years now, the Organization of American Historians, Professional Association of American Historians, has had an on-again, off-again cooperative arrangement with the National Park Service at Civil War sites. And for years, I did at least 2 of these or 3 of these. We would go out in groups of 3 historians, I mean, formal historians, and we would go spend 2 full days at a battlefield site. I did Stones River, Kennesaw Mountain, I can't remember what the third one was. We would examine everything they did, from their exhibitions to their films to everything. Their tours, we'd go on their tours. It wasn't always easy. I mean, it was a little testy with some of the rangers, like, what are you doing here? Bunch of academics. And our job was then to write up reports and try to get them to think bigger, to think about causes and consequences. This was the mandate, actually, that the National Park Service put in writing and put in place, particularly under its previous chief historian, Dwight Pitcaithley. And our job was to try to get them to think about, so how do you tell a broader narrative? And I'll never forget this, because at Kennesaw Mountain, one of the chief rangers there was this lovely guy. His name was Willie something. For that, I don't know why I remember that. But the moment you met him, he said, great to have you here. I just want you to know one thing. I'm a black powder guy. I don't do the rest of it. Which meant he did guns. He knew everything about cannons. He could talk all day about the cannons. But he couldn't tell you a thing, or wouldn't tell you a thing about, so, you know, what was Sherman's army actually doing in northern Georgia? You know? And in our report, just to stay with that example, we asked to see the original mandate of the battlefield site, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In the original mandate from 1934, it said they were to tell the entire story of the entire Atlanta campaign. So we said, whoa. You know how many slave refugees there were following Sherman's army? You know how much Sherman did not want them following his army? That's a story. You know, no, they wouldn't, nothing in their exhibitions about it. So this is a huge problem. The good news is that the people running the National Park Service now, and the new chief historian now is Bob Sutton, who used to be superintendent at Manassas, they've really tried to they held a huge conference about, it's got to be 9-10 years ago now, at Ford's Theater in Washington. They brought, for 2 days, they brought in about a dozen to 15, kind of a who's who of Civil War historians, and we all gave talks from that stage, which, by the way, is one of the most amazing, bizarre places you can give a lecture, right under that booth. You know, it's kind of strange. But they ordered about 200 rangers and historians at the parks. They gave them all 3 days off and brought them to Washington. They had to sit there and listen to all these lectures. Now, I'm not sure that was the best thing they could have done. And out of it, all these lectures were published, and they were all forced to read them, and so on and so forth. Part of the problem is the training of people in the Park Service. Sometimes they're just not that well trained. They're sort of teaching what they know. But another way of thinking about this, and then I'll get off that question, there's a lot in my book, Race and Reunion, about this, the way these battlefields originally were established as park sites. They were originally under the War Department. They didn't come under the Interior Department until the 1930s. And they were established as military parks, telling the site-specific story of the battles. And that's important. I mean, you don't want to go to Shiloh and not know what happened there, right? But it's the key issue. What does the public really want to know about this event? Well, sometimes they have to be educated up. You know, or
Well, if I can interrupt,
Mhm.
I just looked down and checked the manga, and their story, their movie is Johnny Red
Yeah.
recalling this thing about you did this, and
Yeah.
it's all reunion. That's
Yeah.
the only part that they're telling.
It's the blue-gray story. It's the story, it's the assumption in that is that's still the story that the bulk of Americans want to hear and want to know, and that's what they're being given.
That's why I asked you why there should be just at least one storyboard that tells another story.
Well, it's some of the parks that are doing that. I know at Gettysburg now they have a whole new huge visitor center museum, and they even have a final section on the memory of the Civil War, lo and behold. I don't know how that happened. It's still a big issue. Another piece, I'm no Pollyanna on this. We're on the dark side most of the time, but another piece of good news. National Park Service on April 1st, next week, is about to launch a massive new website. It's called Civil War 150. And they hired a firm to help produce it, and they hired about 5 of us historians to evaluate it. I mean, I never waded through so many things on a website in my life. And it's quite remarkable. I mean, it is just chock full of stories and information about every aspect of the war, including causes and consequences, including a pretty significant section on Reconstruction, which is, you know, nobody commemorates Reconstruction. There is no single American historic site, national historic site about Reconstruction. Back during the Clinton years, there was an attempt, it almost happened, to establish the first national historic site or park in Beaufort, South Carolina. It was going to tell the story of but it didn't happen. It was about to happen until the 2000 election, to be honest, and then after that, it just didn't happen. So, anyway, check out the National Parks website. It's designed for tourists. It's designed really primarily for the family thinking about, okay, I want to take my kids somewhere and understand the Civil War in these next 4 years. What should I do? And, it's just full of some great stuff. I hate reading stuff on websites, to be honest, but most people seem to live that way now, 24/7, I guess. Yes? Oh. Anyone? Feel free. Yes, ma'am.
In the 60s,
Yeah.
how, as Robert Warren was looking back on his earlier philosophies compared to his later
Mhm.
philosophies, how did he relate to his fellow fugitives? Because Donald Davidson and those people who were still
Awkwardly.
around, and they still held very firmly. I know Donald Davidson was one of my teachers here, and
Whoa.
held very firmly to his early beliefs.
Yeah. Well, I'll be careful what I say then.
No, but I mean, he didn't mind telling you. He was very,
Uh,
wondered how the relationship.
He still corresponded. He's particularly corresponded with Tate forever. I think they remained closer. I mean, others know a lot more about this than I do. But he remained especially close to Tate. I don't know about Davidson and Ransom. I mean, he was a bit of an apostate, to say the least. When did Davidson die?
In the, maybe 68, 69, I was out of school then, and
I would be fascinated to know what Davidson would have thought of Who Speaks for the Negro, for example. Did they? I don't. Warren's papers are primarily at Yale, which is amazing, and they are unbelievably well organized. And I don't remember any letters between them on that, but I may not have been looking for it. Awkwardly, with time. I mean, how many times did Warren disavow what he had written in Briar Patch? Over and over and over. In interviews. He did zillions of interviews, and the transcripts of most of his interviews are there, and there are a lot of tapes of them too. And he always gets asked the same thing. Why did you write Briar Patch? And he'd give him the same answer. I was a young man. Davidson and Ransom and Tate were my heroes. I mean, this was a different time, and on and on and on. And he would disavow it, and then basically he'd say, "Can you ask me something else?" He became basically a liberal Democrat. He was a Kennedy Democrat in 1960. Whatever that actually meant, in that era. I don't know of anywhere, others here might, I don't know of anywhere here where he, attacked Davidson or Ransom or certainly not Tate over those years. I mean, this was really formative for him. They had been his mentors. And so I suspect he just kept a distance, but that would be worth really exploring in a paper, actually. What kind of relationship did they have in the latter part of, because they were all much older than him.
yes.
There was one other one here if you want to take the time.
We definitely have time.
We're standing between, cookies and reception here, so. Go ahead.
Okay, I was just going to ask you, do you see parallels among the regional differences in the Civil War, civil rights, and now the battle over health care?
Well, at least you didn't ask about gay marriage in the Civil War. I've been asked about that. I don't know. I mean, I don't claim to be a student of the politics of healthcare. I am a student of the politics of the 14th Amendment, which has been very much back in the news and put there by Republicans who want to repeal birthright citizenship. I would guess that no, I don't think there's a regional aspect to resistance to healthcare, for example.
I think there is,
Well, maybe there is. Is it?
which needs it more than anywhere.
Well, maybe it is more profound in the South, but it's also profound in a lot of other very conservative parts of this country, like Orange County, California, and parts of Michigan. This public-private sector battle is, of course, and the whole struggle over federalism is, of course, rooted in the Civil War. Whenever we all get calls now from the Charlotte Observer or the Atlanta Constitution or all these newspapers who all have to write pieces now on the sesquicentennial, they at least the reporters almost always know enough to ask about, so what's this states' rights thing? And I just point them to the current news. governors claiming they're going to nullify. I don't know if you saw, there's an article in the New York Times about 2 weeks ago just listing the number of bills before state legislatures in this country calling for nullification of various kinds of federal legislation, including parts of the Interstate Commerce Clause. I mean, it's become just throwaway, lines about using. So the healthcare thing is obviously part of that larger anti-government, pro-government politics that we have right now. To be frank, since your question is frank, I wish President Obama and others would take bully pulpits and actually educate Americans a little bit about the history of this. We have a terrible history with the states' rights problem. It's called the Civil War. And we ought to do a little educating of people about this, but Obama has a different tact. So, I wish he'd hold a town meeting, and chair it himself and just say, so, my fellow Americans, Social Security, let's see, where did this come from? Why did this happen in the Depression? Gee, where did we get that idea? Why do we have a government? Well, you asked a frank question, so, and I don't know, healthcare, I don't know. Well, thank you very much. This was a pleasure and an honor.